Hello everyone, I am XIIS. I am the developer of PlayFriedrich.com, and today I will start with a tutorial series. And the first one here is about Friedrich Tactics and general tips, and the following are specific for every role. Um, what I also try to explain is the core strategy of Prussia, because this is key to determine if you made a good move or not. And maybe one thing that I should talk about is, this is of course only my opinion. I'm not the best player in the world, probably not the worst either. So you can have your own thoughts. And this is for beginners. So if you are an experienced player, you should know this, what I'm talking about. So, at the start, I want to talk about resources. Friedrich is a war game, of course, but to determine if your move is good or not, I recommend it to analyze it in a more economic style. So the first thing is, what resources do we have in Friedrich? And the most obvious one is your cards. I will start with them later. Another resource are your generals and the troops you have. Um, the next one is your victory cities or objectives you have to defend, or what you want to conquer. And the last one is the time or the round, uh, because if you are not fast enough, the Prussia player will win. So as I said before we will start, I will explain the core strategy of Prussia. If you look at the income, Prussia has an income of 9 combined with Hanover, and the Allies have an income of 14 to 15, depending on how you count the France discard. So the Allies have around about 50% more income cards-wise than the Prussian player. So if the Prussian player just keeps fighting in every color, he should run out of cards very soon. So what's the solution to this problem? It is that the Prussian player should choose one specific color for every role and should only defend in this color, and should keep fighting only in this sector in this color. Because then he statistically gets, let's say, 7. We ignore fate events, and he should always get more cards in every color than another specific role. Yeah. So if he gets 7 cards, let's say, he should round about 2 cards from every color every round. And let's say the Russian player, it's easy, 4 divided by 4, he should get only 1 card per color statistically. So if the Prussia player keeps on fighting in only one specific color, he should always have the advantage, yeah, in cards at least. Yeah, this means he chooses, for example, clubs versus the Russian, spades versus Austria, and hearts versus France, and then he has one reserve color where he can eventually switch or can restock his troops. What key colors you can choose for every role, and so on, which colors are important or not. This I will explain in my further guides when I go into detail for every role. So now I will start telling you something more about cards and statistics. It's not that you have to calculate always exactly um, your probability of something, but you should have a feeling of if you are ahead or how far you are ahead or behind. Um, and you should, yeah, make your choices because of that. So, an important number which you should remember is 7.5. 7.5 is the average card value. Yeah. So if you have, let's say here, 5 of clubs cards, 5 multiplied with 7.5 is your average, which is around about 30. So we are, yeah, in average here, more or less. Um, what you also can do is you can divide the 7.5 by 4, and then you can also calculate the average easier maybe, what the other players should have in every color. Yeah. 7.5 divided by 4 is 1.825, I think. And then you can multiply this with the amount of cards in total, and then you have the average of cards of some specific role. So I make an example to make it more clear. Let's say we count 7.5. You can calculate with 2 maybe, yeah, then it's easier. So I have, as an Austria player, I have 20 cards now, and if I multiply this with 2, I should have 40 roundabout in every color as card values. And as you can see, it's not really true because this is only the average, but yeah. And you have to think that it's not 2, it's a little bit less. So, but so it may be easier if, let's say, the Russian player has 5 plus cards. If you multiply this with 2 and take a little bit less, so you know, okay, if he has now 5, let's say he has then 10 per color in average. Okay. So this is important, especially in the early stages, and of course only then if you don't have played any of your cards really. Yeah? If you have your third combat and in hearts, for example, then of course this doesn't. This is not right anymore. But at the early stages, when there weren't any combats, or you didn't spend any card, then you should calculate this, or have at least a feeling about it, if you are ahead or behind, or how much you are ahead or behind. Good. Another really important thing, or what you can do, is that you look at your other nations, what you play, and yeah, take this card information you got from this other nation into your decisions. Yeah, this is relevant, um, especially in the early stages, again, because if you have 80 cards with Austria, for example, then the 10 or 15 cards from the Imperial Army doesn't matter so much. But in the early stages, there this is sometimes relevant. So I see here, okay, I have 2 of spades again. So maybe the Prussian player is low on spades, but yeah, I have 3, so yeah. Another thing, one with the minor nations you can do, a little trick maybe. Most of the time you, or especially beginners, don't fight so much, and the number of rounds is after turn 4, 5, sorry. Um, yeah, it's hidden, and you can take the cards of the Imperial Army, or let's say Sweden, and can count them. And if you didn't fight in this game, you have the exact number of rounds. Yeah. So this is one little trick where you can yeah, determine the exact number of rounds. Also, you could do this, of course, with the other nations. Yeah, if they didn't fight, then you can divide this by their income, and could so get the number of rounds. But with an income of 1, it's obviously easier to calculate. Okay. So in general, not only high cards are good. High cards are good for offensive combat, but especially as Prussian player, uh, you should also keep some low cards, because low cards are good for retreating. Yeah. So much about cards. Next thing I want to talk about is movement. I think movement is really underrated, and it's really important on the one hand, and really cool because movement is for free, and you don't need any cards for that. So what you should do, you should go for flexible and central positions, and these positions should defend or attack objectives, yeah, or should threaten to attack objectives. So, for example, Breslau would be a really cool and stable position for the Prussian player, because he has all the choices, and can go everywhere, and it defends a lot of cities. The next thing you should do is you should focus on the first order of objectives. So what I mean here with Austria and the Imperial Army, you have your first order objectives with this flag, and the second order objectives with this flag. And it's most of the time, let's say 90%, not worth it to attack or even conquer second order objectives. This is only relevant if the Prussian player is really bad, um, because let's say the Russian or whoever wins in before turn 10, for example, then probably the Imperial Army didn't switch. So as an Austria player, you have to conquer the second order objectives, which is really annoying. But if you are playing against an experienced Prussian player, he should hold long enough that the Imperial Army switches and east wind conditions uh, come into effect. So yeah, you can, as an Austria player at least, you can more or less ignore normally the second order objectives, and as a Prussian player, you should ignore them. So another thing, very obvious, you should use these main roads because you are more flexible. You can go more steps, and you should also try to stay on them because then you can do this again next round. Yeah. Another thing also important, especially for the allies, I would say, is you should care about your supply trains, especially for nations who don't have any home territory, yeah, which is France and Russia. I think most important is that for France, because um, the distance between the base and your generals is quite far, and if you lose both supply trains in the same turn, it's really bad for you. And for the Russian player, it's also very bad, but most of the time you have one supply train here because you're fighting in East Prussia, and one here, and um, if one gets destroyed, you can move the other one west, and most of the time it's enough. But of course, it's also not good to lose both supply trains. But yeah, it's very important for France. But on the other hand, a mistake which beginners do is you should not be over carefully for your supply trains, or at least one. You should also use them, yeah, kind of offensively. Yeah. Let's say the Austrian player, which doesn't have to care so much about the supply chain, he can move the supply chain to a position where it is bad for the Prussian player to hit this supply train, or he can threaten an encirclement. Yeah, for example, if he moved this here, it would be bad for the Prussian player to hit, because then he can do some cross-border attacks, for example. So move your supply chain with the troops, and yeah, position it to, or at least one, yeah, not both, but one, to threaten encirclement or yeah, to stop the Prussian player from moving, for example, which is also a cool thing to do. Yeah. Also, as an Prussian player, you can also use your supply train to block um, cities from conquering for one round because he has the attacker has to stop. Yeah. For example, yes, if I don't in range or don't want to move in range to defend this city, Küstrin, I can move and supply train on the city, and this buys me one round of time. So I mentioned it maybe 1 minute ago. Cross-border positions are really, really dangerous, and a lot of beginners don't care about it, and this is where you can lose really hard. As I told you in the beginning, normally the Prussian strategy is to choose one color where he strictly defends against you. Yeah, and you can more or less ignore all the colors at least in the later stages, and it only counts or matters on one or two colors. And with cross-border, I mean if you look at these sectors, this would be a cross-border position because the Prussian is in spades, and he the Austrian player can attack this in diamonds, for example, here. So depending on how the Prussian player wanna defend, it's a good or a bad move to attack here. Yeah, if he wanted to defend in spades, it's bad for the Prussian because then the Austrian can trade his diamonds versus the Prussian spades. But if he wants to defend in diamonds, it would be bad to attack as an Austrian player because, yeah, I trade my diamonds versus the spades. And this is really, really important to know, and um, yeah, to decide uh, when I wanna use these positions or where when I can trade at cross border or not. Um, Another very basic thing you should care about encirclements because yeah, this is obviously bad, especially again encirclements with cross border um, is also very dangerous because then he can use multiple colors. So let's say this here, the Prussian generals would be encircled because he has to fight until he dies. Because every retreat would kill his whole stack because he can't retreat. So, so much about movement. Maybe one last point. If you want to defend a city, this is relevant for the Prussian player. You should stay as close as possible to a city. As I told you, if you stand on the city, the attacker can't conquer it this turn. Yeah, no matter if it is a supply chain or a general, so it buys you at least one round. And let's say you are not on the city when I want to defend Breslau, for example, you should stay as close as possible. Why? Because you are more flexible with your retreats. Yeah, if you are planning a retreat, of course. So if this guy attacks here, for example, like this is a testing game, so don't care about the rules here about movement and so on. Then I could do a -1 retreat, and this is still defended, or I can do a -2 retreat, and it's also still defended. So stay as close as possible to the city you want to defend, or sometimes you can also block the city with a supply chain, as I mentioned, or general, and it will buy you one round for sure. So let's talk about attacking. Fighting is cool, but also a mistake beginners do, especially when they play Prussia, is that they fight a lot and take fights they shouldn't take. And I want to mention one thing which is maybe not so much clear for all, that attacking is way more dangerous than defending. Why is it so? For multiple reasons. Let's say I do this attack. First, if you are the attacker, you keep fighting and so on, and then the combat is decided. But the defender has the option to do a counter strike next turn. So if you played all your cards, then we have a problem, let's say. And also when you're losing and he treats you here, he can do a counter strike and then you get probably totally destroyed. So that's also one reason why you should never play all your cards in a combat. There are always exceptions, of course, but in general, we talking, you should always have a few amount of cards what you can use to retreat from the counter attack when it's the defender's turn where he can counter attack you. The next thing he can do is if he is the winner, he can retreat you to positions where you could get encircled. Yeah. So, for example, Austria attacks here. You take a -1 after some cards. He could retreat you to the city, and yeah, well, let's say you know what I mean. This also doesn't work, but whatever. He could retreat you to cities where you could get encircled next turn in the counterattack. Also, a thing he could do is that he retreats you to any cross-border positions where he also gets a favorable attack. So really care about attacking, especially in the early stages. If you try to attack Prussia, he has the superiority in cards, so you probably won't win. So it's really dangerous, or you have to think about it if it's worth it or not, and better take early and retreat. So in general, you should think before attacking. What do I want to achieve, and how will my opponent react, and what is my response for this reaction? I mean with that, will he defend the city, or does he want to win this combat, or will he try to retreat as fast as possible? Yeah, this decision you should always have in your mind. Of course, you don't know exactly what he will do, but yeah, if it's round 15 and you have 80 cards as Austria and the Prussian player has only 20, he probably won't defend this forever. Yeah, this city. And depending on this reaction, you should play your cards. I will explain this later a little bit. Another thing, what you should always keep in mind is that cards are worth more, yeah, so you could say, than troop superiority. So let's say in the early stages, or in general, the Prussian player never has the troop superiority, you could say, yeah. So here he has maybe 15, and then he's fighting against 3 stacks, 24 or whatever, or against the Russian, he has 13 to 14 against 7 maybe, and against France he is also let's say one general with 2, 3, 4, I don't know, against 15 or what. Yeah. But the Prussian player has more cards, and this troop difference is only 1 round. So it's of course good to attack with troop superiority. What you should do always, especially as an attacking ally, but don't overrate it, because this is only in the first combat round relevant. Um, so maybe one thing related to that, if you have the card disadvantage, you should attack with troop superiority. And if you have the card advantage, because it's late in the game, you should attack with troop inferiority. Why? Because then you have the possibility to draw more cards from the Prussian player when you constantly play him on 0. Yeah. So let's say we have this stack here. It's late in the game. You know the Prussian player has only a few cards left. You shouldn't attack always this way, because then he can retreat easily. But you could attack with one general, let's say, or with only one, and then you could play him on 0 and continue playing on 0, and that will draw him cards, and yeah, it gives you on the long term an advantage. Another thing I mentioned is don't always fight until you don't have any cards left. Of course, there are exceptions. If the game is ending in this round, you should play all in. Another thing you should do, keep your reserves as long as possible. And if someone plays you on 0, as I explained here, you should play low cards with the same number. So let's say you have 3 spades, 5 of spades. This would be a good card to play when he plays you on 0. Yeah, because higher cards he can combine other cards more easy to get this number, but with lower cards it's more difficult. So look at your cards and if you want to break this play, yeah. But yeah, good. Though the next thing I want to talk about is spy. As I mentioned, most of the time only 1 or 2 colors are relevant for you as an attacker, so buy in your off color. So as an Austria player, this is most of the time hearts, for example. Yeah, hearts you don't really need. If you need to stack your troops, buy with your hearts. Another thing I often see, which is not recommended, is don't max your troops instantly if you have lost any troops. It's really cool to be flexible. So let's say the Austrian player has lost some troops, he has only 25 now. Don't max your troops instantly because often later in the game the Prussian player will buy um, this amount of troops that he can easily retreat from your stack in the near. And if you maxed your troops, you can't really break this pattern unless you're attacking only with 2 out of 3 generals, for example. But if you don't have maxed your troops, you can always buy maybe 1 or 2 additional troop, and then he can maybe not retreat so easily and is forced to play more cards. So we are more flexible, and most of the time it doesn't really matter, yeah, if you have 1 or 2 troops more, economic wise. Yeah. What you should always do is bring your generals back into play as fast as possible. So as a Prussian player, you will lose some generals with 1 troops. For example, if your P8 has only 1, and others, you should always bring them as fast as possible back into play, because you don't have any disadvantages, and this gives you more flexibility. So don't let them here be in your graveyard, and as ally as well. Another little thing you could yeah you could think about is the events tell you that if the Prussian player has to remove one general, it's never P1. So not a bad thing would be to max your P1, because this guy can't never removed by fate events. Yeah, so if you have to select one general to remove, it's always, but it can't be P1. And quite the same is if France leaves the game. Cumberland also leaves the game. So this is also, yeah, a little thing what you could have in mind, that it's maybe better to have the force, or the power of the force on H1 than H2, but yeah, doesn't doesn't really do so much. And another thing for buying is what I also mentioned before, buy for future attacks or retreats. Yeah. So for example, if you know, I don't know, let's say Russian generals are split here, and you know this is an 8 troop general, you should have 7 on P7, for example. Then you can all retreat by 1, by -1 every time. Yes, and he can't really do something about it. And on the other hand, if you are ahead, let's say this is 16, or let's say it's 10, yeah, for example, um, you can buy troops or attack with troops that are +2, which is not so favorable for the defender, because he can't retreat -1. He can take the +2, of course, but or the -2, sorry. But then he will lose another troop, and a difference of 2, he would spend a reserve to do a -1 retreat, which is of course not worth it. So it's this is also one possibility. If you want to play him cards, then you could attack with a +2, so priority in troops. And at the end, a few general tips. You should use your minor nations like the Imperial Army and Sweden proactively. I've seen players with Sweden 15 cards and never fighting and running away. This is yeah, not the way I would recommend it to play, but I will go in for that in more detail in my future tutorials. Then in general you should um, apply the right amount of pressure as an ally. Yeah, every ally should apply pressure. This means not stupid attacks all the time, but you can also apply pressure by movement constantly, at least after turn 4, let's say. And one last thing, which is maybe also interesting, is the turn order. The turn order is relevant in a few points. The first thing is, in the very early stages, it means that the Prussia card advantage is even more, yeah, relevant than later because of the turn order. The Prussian player always is the first, so he gets the first cards. So let's say it's turn 2, and you moved in a position where you could, and the Austrian player moved in a position where the Prussian player could attack in his turn 2, then the Prussian player has around about 3 times of cards, yeah, 14 to 5 compared to the Austrian player. So this, yeah, I call it turn order advantage, will be less and less for every round, but especially in the early stages, it's you should keep that in mind. Another thing is you should always plan the future movements if you are playing 2 nations. So don't block with your Austrian generals, for example, the movement of your imperial army. And another thing where the turn order could be relevant is if the Prussian player is defending in the same color against 2 rolls, let's say hearts. This happens sometimes. Hearts is always important for the France, but sometimes the Prussian player also defends hearts versus Russia. Then you have the problem, let's say, that the Russian player is always before the France player. So if the Russian player attacks, he will probably win or not, whatever, but he will draw hearts of the Prussian, and the France maybe has the advantage from that, because the Prussian player could be out of hearts because of his Russian combat. So yeah, keep that in mind. If the Prussian player is defending in the same color, the turn order could be relevant. So that's it. I hope you could follow more or less my explanations, and I will do some role-specific tutorials in the future where I go more in detail about this setup and strategies of these roles. Thank you.